All right. Well, welcome everyone to this Global Health Symposium session titled It's All Related, Infection, Inflammation, Chronic Disease, and Cancer. My name is Matt Cromit. I am beaming in today from Dallas. Wish I could be there with you all in San Antonio today, but hey, let's try something new and we'll have a virtual moderator and 4 in-person panelists. This should be fun. I'm a managing director at Lida Hill Philanthropies and LH Capital, where I support our founder, Lida Hill, and her mission to make advances in nature and science through philanthropic and for-profit investments. My background's in global health, so I've really been looking forward to moderating this panel at this year's Texas Biomed Global Health Symposium for a while now. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, who as I'm sure many of you followed for many years, I'd like to set the stage a bit for our discussion today. One which we imagine will have plenty of time for audience participation, virtual and in person, kind of towards the end of the session. The title of this session is, in my mind, very appropriate for this year's symposium, as it is all related. Not only the 4 topics listed in the title, infection, inflammation, chronic disease, and cancer, but also other topics core to this conference, such as health equity, and how different populations often experience a greater incidence and prevalence of infectious disease, inflammation, chronic disease, and cancer. Over the next 45 minutes or so, our panelists will reveal the relevance of these topics, the challenges facing them, and really the team science required to find approaches and solutions to those challenges. We at Lida Hill Philanthropies are very proud supporters of Texas Biomed, and I think gathering a panel of this quality is one reason why we're so thrilled to support this organization. Doctors Schlesinger, Rizzo, Taylor, and Dayhut on the same panel. I mean, pinch me, that doesn't happen every day. So let me briefly introduce each panelist, and then we'll hand it over to them in, I think, this order for opening statements. So first, Dr. Larry Schlesinger, Professor, President, and CEO of Texas Biomed. Dr. Schlesinger is an internationally recognized authority on infectious diseases. He became president and CEO of Texas Biomedical Research Institute in 2017 and is leading a truly transformational process focused on scientific growth and cultural change at the Institute. Since his arrival, Texas Biomed has added 16 new faculty members, raised more than $60 million through philanthropic efforts and other avenues to recruit scientists, create new programs, and address infrastructure needs. He's also overseen the restructuring of leadership and business practices, leading to more than a doubling of grants and contracts at Texas Biomed in recent years. Next to Dr. Schlesinger is Dr. Albert Rizzo, who is Chief Medical Officer for the American Lung Association and has long been a key medical advisor to the American Lung Association, a member of the Lung Cancer Expert Medical Advisory Panel, and a leading media spokesperson for the association. In his role as Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Rizzo is responsible for ensuring that the American Lung Association is always using the best science and medicine to formulate and deliver on its mission. Additionally, Dr. Rizzo helps drive lung health innovation, challenge the association to reach those in greatest need, and strengthen its relationships with professional medical and patient organizations. Our next panelist is Dr. Barbara Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a professor of infectious diseases and the assistant dean for the MD-MPH program at UT Health San Antonio. Dr. Taylor conducts research to improve health outcomes for those living with or at risk for HIV, with a specific focus on Latin populations. She also is a principal investigator of multiple NIH-funded collaborative studies on COVID, including the COVID-19 Prevention Network, which leads COVID-19 vaccine trials, and the RECOVER study, which is the largest prospective study of long COVID in the US. And finally, Dr. Bill Dayhut, who serves as the Chief Scientific Officer for the American Cancer Society. In this role, he oversees the strategic direction of both intramural and extramural research for the largest nonprofit funder of cancer research. Dr. Dayhut manages all pieces of the organization's discovery work, including surveillance and health equity science, population science, cancer screening guidelines, and extramural discovery science. He serves as the scientific voice of the organization, advises key discovery positions, and manages more than $400 million in research funding. Bill guides efforts to enhance and focus the American Cancer Society's research program, concentrating priorities where they will be most effective and working with key partners and supporters to further progress. Again, we are so fortunate to hear from this group of panelists today. And with that, panelists, please discuss your perspective on the importance of the topic at hand, how these things are all related. So let's start with Larry.
Thank you very much, Matt. You look incredibly professional on the screen and you're in living color. And I'm also honored to be part of this panel and obviously very excited about this entire symposium, which itself I think is the beginning of transformation, and I like that. So I'm going to practice my passion in starting this today, which is to be the geekiest one at this symposium, but translate science into something completely understandable. Okay, let's see how I do. So I'm going to tell you something to start. Bugs don't cause disease. Bugs do not cause disease. Okay? Now you have to believe me that what bugs do is they come into our body as foreigners, and our body kind of goes, what is this? And the body then engages the immune system. Immune system is our way of keeping healthy every day of our lives. And so the immune system has to look at this foreigner and say, I got to deal with this. And so the immune system gets activated. If the immune system was so precise, it would clear whatever that foreign bug is without any symptoms whatsoever. But in almost all cases, and particularly with this new strain of COVID-19, the immune system says, I've not seen this before, and so it goes into overdrive. And as a result of the overdrive of that immune system, there's a consequence. And the consequence of that immune system overdrive is something called inflammation. Now, if you get a cut on your finger, you have inflammation. You all know what it looks like. But the truth be told, it resolves itself, right? In a few days, you put a Band-Aid on it, and you're fine. Put a little bazotracin on it. Well, when the bug comes in your lung, for example, with COVID, you would hope for the same thing. A localized response, localized inflammation, and it's gone in a couple of days. The problem with inflammation is that in some people, it can become systemic, and it can itself go in overdrive and cause a lot of disease. Disease is caused by us. Fever is caused by us, not the bug, okay? Many bugs we encounter every day we have no response to because our body's very used to it. So the truth be told, it really is about us when we're talking about infectious diseases. All right, so I like that triad then of a bug, an immune system, and consequence inflammation. The importance of that is every week now, almost in Science magazine or Cell or some other magazine, is the link between inflammation and a variety of diseases. Long COVID is just the newest example of a bug that maybe is completely gone, but now we have this overdrive inflammation, and that's driving heart disease, brain fog, kidney disease, etc. Well, we've known for a very long time that infection clearly triggers other diseases. One of the earliest ones, group-based streptococcus, strep throat, causes rheumatic fever and heart valve disease. We've known for a very long time that hepatitis B, if you have it, a subsegment of the population can get liver cancer. Human papillomavirus, right? We have a vaccine for that now. Cervical cancer, head and neck cancer. It's not really far, there's a link there. We know that a variety of viruses have been linked to a variety of brain diseases, Parkinson's disease, for example. So we need to learn about the link between an infection, the immune system inflammatory response, and these other diseases. The next fact I'm going to tell you, which might surprise you, is we're all in this room together. What percentage of our DNA do we share identically? What do you think? 99.6%. Thank you, Gary. This guy knows the answer to this. 99.6% of our DNA in this room is identical. Isn't that amazing, right? We don't look the same. This must mean that the 0.4% must be pretty important. It turns out that 0.4% leads to millions of changes in the building blocks of our DNA, these so-called base pairs. And I'm not going to get geekier on you, but these mutations that are throughout our genome can make a huge difference in what makes us different. Now you layer on environmental effects, gender effects, different populations, different races, and it even becomes bigger, all based on a very minority part of our DNA. Those changes have huge consequence in the way our body reacts to anything. So why do some people die with COVID-19 and others have a self-limited infection? Well, some of it we might hear about because it's definitely a lung disease, but some of it is because that 0.4% environmental background, race, etc., can impact the degree of inflammation that we have and the systemic nature of that inflammation. And this can lead then to some people getting long COVID and others not. So we need to learn more about this linkage, and we need to learn more about what that difference is. This is different than looking at a mutation that causes a rare genetic disorder. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about these mutations that are throughout each of our genomes that in a combinatorial together will cause a difference in our immune system between you and me. And I think this is a very hot area of science and one we need to learn more about and pretty much connect science all together. The last point I want to make related to this is when you get a cough and some fever, do any of you get a Z-Pack from your doctor? Raise your hands. How about if I tell you that some of you will metabolize that Z-Pack 1,000 times differently than the next person? 1,000 times different. Yet we all get the same dose and the same duration. Does that make sense? But that's medicine today. So it kind of backs into the concept of personalized medicine, which is definitely a field of science that continues to grow, and we begin to learn more and more about what can define those differences and potentially predict those differences. Some fields a little more advanced than others. It turns out that so-called pharmacogenomics or drug metabolism is a little farther ahead than some other areas. But this all again relates to that genetic diversity, which we need to appreciate, particularly in the context of this symposium. So these are some of the ideas that I wanted to throw out to start the comments today, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Larry. Well, thank you for letting me be on this panel. I think the title of it, All Related, is very appropriate. Infection, inflammation, chronic disease, and cancer. And that could not really sum up better the gambit of disease that the American Lung Association has had to deal with over its 110, 15-year history. We started out as the American Society, National Association of Society to Prevent Tuberculosis, Study and Prevent Tuberculosis, near and dear to Dr. Schlesinger's heart. And now the community we serve has multiple lung conditions that we have to deal with. We know the burden of tuberculosis has been lessened, although not gone, and we certainly are concerned that multiple drug-resistant TB remains an issue around the world, and hopefully not too much of an issue in this country, but we need to be prepared for that. We also know that we had this recent toll of the pandemic from COVID-19. We know that we get periodic flu outbreaks that are devastating to many individuals. We also have surprise epidemics of the triple epidemic of RSV, influenza, and COVID that hit the last year or two in certain areas of the country. So we need to deal with the infectious part of these insults, and I think Dr. Schlesinger made a good baseline for what the immune system does for that. We also need to deal with the fact that inflammation, that was mentioned, can be chronic, and with lung disease, the big ones are COPD and asthma. That's inflammation in the lungs. And we deal with also the fact that this inflammation is probably playing a role in what cells go on to become cancerous. And therefore, the lung cancer, which is the #1 cancer killer of both men and women in this country as well as the world, is something we have to deal with as far as the Lung Association. Now, we know that the lung plays a big role in gas exchange. If you can't breathe, nothing else matters is one of our taglines. But as Dr. Schlesinger pointed out, the lung, besides that, the lung is a very important part of our immune system. And without that immune system, a lot of the insults that come into our airways would not be handled as well as they should. We sometimes refer to the fact that certain infections or inhaled irritants lead to inflammation that may be called, quote, good inflammation, the amount that we need to fight off the disease. However, when inflammation gets out of control, there's bad inflammation. And that inflammation can lead to the chronic diseases I mentioned. We also know now that with cancer biology over the last couple of decades, we know it's not just the cell itself that we have to be aware of. It's the actual tissue stroma that that cell is in, something called the tumor microenvironment. And again, that's where the immune system plays a big role in bringing certain cells into that area that can be helpful, sometimes harmful. And then there's a development of either an anti-tumor effect or a pro-tumor effect that can develop as a result of how our body responds to that insult. We mentioned the germline, the genetic code, and really about a minority of cancers in the lung develop out of genetic mutations spontaneously. About 25 to 30% can be infections related. Another 25 to 30% can be tobacco related and inhaled irritants like air pollution. And the rest are often attributed to dietary factors and obesity. I think what we need to realize is that all these diseases affect us differently because of our immune system, but then they also affect people around us differently because of things we talked about yesterday, the social determinants of health. One of the things I want to talk about more in our discussion is the fact that the Lung Association puts out 3 yearly reports called signature reports: state of the air, state of tobacco control, and state of lung cancer. And what these point out is really these are data that's collected from both governmental and public databases, and it's put into lay language that everybody will understand as to what's happening in their state and in the federal government with regard to how they handle tobacco control, air quality, and diagnosing cancer. State of tobacco control this year once again showed that policymakers in different parts of this country have to do a better job with regard to tobacco control laws, clean air laws. The state of lung cancer report showed that the way that each state deals with lung cancer, even from the standpoint of how they report it and track it, is very different. And that goes on to show the disparities that occur when we look at the outcomes with lung cancer diagnosis and treatment. And then the state of the air shows, the most recent one shows that there's still about 1 in 3 individuals, close to 120 million people in this country, who live in areas with failing grades with regard to healthy air. And those 2 main things that we look at are ozone and particle pollution. So I think those 3 reports show a lot of information that's used by the media, certainly, but policymakers look at these on a yearly basis, and we use them to advocate for better laws in their localities and their states. We also advocate at the federal level to do better jobs with regard to tobacco control. What's the FDA doing? We go to the EPA and talk about better requirements of the NACs, the ozone and the particulate matter. So I'm going to leave it at there and pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? All right, so thank you so much. It is really an honor to be here with this esteemed panel. And as the second infectious diseases doctor on the panel, I'm going to focus on 2 viral infections, HIV and SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. So when you think about HIV in the 21st century, the joy that I have is that HIV is a chronic infection, which of course it didn't used to be. And most of my patients take 1 pill once a day. They can live a long and healthy, normal lifespan. And also successful HIV treatment breaks the chain of transmission because someone who's on successful treatment cannot pass the virus on to anyone else. So this is all amazing news and brought to you by science. But chronic HIV infection is still a chronic infection, and it leads to chronic inflammation. And whether or not you measure that by T cell activation or cytokine release or bacterial translocation in the intestine, people living with HIV have chronic inflammation for their entire lives. And that has consequences. So we see increased rates of cardiovascular disease, increased rates of liver and lung disease and kidneys disease, and increased rates of cancer appropriate to the topic today. And it is interesting to note that over the last several decades, research has really showed that there's been a transformation, the type of cancer we're seeing in people with HIV. We've gone from AIDS-related malignancies like Kaposi's sarcoma to malignancies that are not traditionally considered related to HIV. Lung cancer, liver cancer, head and neck cancer, anal cancer, all of these cancers are now on the rise among people with HIV and really threatening the gains that we have seen in terms of lifespan and treatment. Why do these cancers show up more in people with HIV? Well, it's a combination of factors. There's an intersection. We have chronic inflammation. We have other viral infections like HPV that Larry mentioned. And then the thing that we have to remember, although we all as researchers focus on infections or conditions, is that we are talking about people. We are talking about communities. And very commonly with infectious diseases, whether it's HIV or tuberculosis or COVID, the communities that are most impacted are marginalized. And we know that in marginalized communities, as we understand the role that stress plays in chronic inflammation, that marginalized communities in the United States, abroad, have higher rates of stress, higher rates of violence, higher rates of adverse childhood experiences. All of these things contribute to stress, which then lead to inflammation, which combine with the chronic infection to create poor health outcomes. So what we're really seeing is the intersection of health equity and infection and inflammation. COVID in some ways is a very unfortunate and perfect example of this. So we at UT Health are fortunate to work on a very large NIH-funded collaboration called Recover, where we're studying COVID over time. So a recent Kaiser Family Foundation study showed that 6% of the US population currently has symptoms of long COVID. So that's 6% of the US population. That's 20 million people. If you expand that globally, that's 480 million people. We have seen, as Larry mentioned, post-infectious syndromes before. This is not our first rodeo. Actually, one of the more famous ones is Woodrow Wilson had post-infectious neurologic impairment after he suffered from the 1918 influenza pandemic, which affected his ability to negotiate in Paris for the Treaty of Versailles, which probably led to World War II. So that didn't work out so well for us. And long COVID is really a challenge. We don't understand predictors of long COVID. We need to know more about pathogenesis because we need to move really rapidly into treatment. And we know that COVID had a profound and disproportionate impact in communities of color, in frontline workers, in essential workers. And we need to bring evidence-based therapy very quickly to these populations. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about this and also really happy to be a part of the efforts that it takes to bring evidence-based treatment through research to the communities who need it most. I keep trying to pass them on.
So I guess it's my turn. So this is actually very interesting. So thank you very much. So as mentioned earlier, I'm with the American Cancer Society, and every January, that's April Fool's joke, every January since the early 1950s, we've released our cancer facts and figures. And this year we've had interesting information. You know, cancer mortality has fallen by 34% since its peak in the early 90s, which is tremendous news. And we've seen in virally mediated cancer, cervical cancer rates fell by 65% in the population of largely of women, because it was cervical cancer, obviously, in women who received the vaccine during the first cohort who received it. So that's unbelievable information showing that if you intervene with a vaccine, you actually can prevent a viral infection which leads to cancer. So this is spectacular news. But overall, there were some other things we saw that are concerning, and that's why it's important as we think about this. So we're seeing an increased rate of cancer in younger individuals. We're seeing it in colorectal cancer. We're seeing it in breast cancer. There are trends in prostate cancer. And this is a problem that is not clearly obvious, the reasons why, but likely related to the factors we've talked about it. There hasn't been a genetic change over the last 20 or 30 years of inherited germline findings, which could really account for this increased rate, particularly of colorectal cancer, which it used to be about 11% for young people. Now it's 20%. Younger people are presenting with more advanced disease. In breast cancer, we see nearly a doubling of young women presenting with more advanced disease. So this isn't related to increased BRCA2 mutations or ATM mutations or Lynch syndrome. This is an environmental change that is largely inflammatory in basis. And if you think about it, it's not related to something that happened just before the cancer diagnosis. Because it's not simply that you had a fatty diet or even an acute infection and you develop cancer shortly afterwards. So this is something that's going on where folks are being exposed to, whether it's environmental, whether it's diet, whether it's lack of exercise, whether it's all the other factors that we know are driving inflammation. That's why this is so important. And as we think of strategies, how to overcome this, ultimately you need to think of ways to better to screen for these aspects and ultimately to prevent them. So American Cancer Society also is well known for coming up with cancer guidelines. We're actually going to have lung cancer guidelines. They're going to come out next month that our esteemed colleagues have been involved with. But as we think more broadly, our aspirational goal is that cancer screening guidelines should really be personalized, precision-based, and adaptable over time. Because your risk for cancer is not simply your average risk. So our guidelines are all driven to the average risk individual. Your average risk for colorectal cancer, you should have a screening colonoscopy starting at the age 45 or another way to look for colon rectal cancer. But as we come up with strategies to think about what can we do for those folks that are at highest risk to screen differently, or even things about ways to potentially prevent the cancer. So we think about virally mediated cancers, and we're learning more and more about the importance of it. Hepatitis was mentioned, HPV was mentioned, H. pylori is important, Merkel cell is important. So there are a lot of virally mediated cancers. And as we think about strategies, either one, should we be screening folks differently? If you have an HPV infection that's cervically driven, it's often a pathologic diagnosis based on HPV testing, but those that with risk for exposure for head and neck cancer or other areas, not so easy to screen for. So if we think about that, it's really important. And how about H. pylori, which is an infection which actually leads to inflammation in the stomach and ulcer-like symptoms? We now know there's an interaction between having that infection and inherited genetic mutations, often what we call the DDR pathway. So those are the BRCA mutations. So looking at these interactions. And then the infections are not all the same. We call HPV, we talk about hepatitis, we talk about like they're all just one infection, but there are multiple different serotypes, different strains essentially of the infection, which some are not as well covered by our vaccines. There are certain parts of HPV infections that are not actually as well covered as the other ones, but still can lead to cancer, and some that may interact differently. So one thing we'd like to do strategically, we're having a major effort to eliminate all cervical cancer. We can eliminate HPV-driven cancers if we have everybody actually vaccinated at an age that's reasonable to prevent the infections, somewhere probably age 9 or 10. But there's also large populations of individuals who have exposures to infections, who are seropositive vaccination for infections, who are at risk for cancer development. So as we become much more aspirational, and this is actually a project we're actually having discussions about it actually this morning, about doing sort of worldwide challenges to come up with ways to actually decrease the risk of cancer from folks who have infections that we can't clear. If you can clear the infection, that's great. On cancer, with a therapeutic strategy. And I think folks would be much more willing to take preventive treatments if they know their own risk is much higher. And this has to be thought thoughtfully. Is it, which populations, which age groups, what's the treatment going to be? But only with working with people who had new vaccines can we actually do this. And as an oncologist, I thought we just talked to the ID people to ask them what antibiotics to use. But apparently you guys are much more important than that. So, we're thinking about this. We have a lot of excitement about this, particularly about HPV, but other virally mediated cancers. I think we're going to discover more in subtypes, because I think it's not going to be everybody who has the infection will be driven to a cancer, but there will be combinations of other exposures, internal risk factors, your own genetics, and that's why this is so important. So thank you, and happy to answer some of the questions.
Great, thank you. And Bill, it's great to hear you speak about HPV and cancer. I can attest that the American Cancer Society is a real leader in this space. We've had the privilege supporting ACS in North Texas to increase coverage rates of a vaccine. It's leading to really much better vaccination adoption and completion rates here, which we know by the data will lead to lives saved. So that's a great point to make. And then thank you all. Those opening comments really set the stage for the rest of the session. So let's dive in with some follow-up questions. I'll ask a question to each of you, starting with Dr. Schlesinger. Larry, you started to touch on this in your opening statement. If results of an infection can cause a different reaction in different people, why do we provide the same subscriptive solution for all people often?
Yeah, the simple answer is we don't know enough, and we don't have a little chip that we can use in people to tell them exactly what we can give them versus someone else. But I will make a point that when we talk about personalized medicine, in some groups I talk to, I get a glaze over the eyes. It's pie in the sky, we'll never get there. But we wrote a paper a few years ago that actually talked about regionalizing therapy, because it turns out if you do genetic studies over different continents, you actually can see some patterns of genetic changes that might actually give us a clue to tell us whether we vaccinate tuberculosis patients in China different than we vaccinate people in the North America, for example. Let's not get right down to individual, but maybe we can get regional with some of the ways our new technology is allowing us to understand different populations. Not directly to answer the question, I want to make 2 points before I forget it. With regard to the importance of inclusion in studies, with regard to environment and lung, I'll give you a fact from our research. I studied tuberculosis in the lung, and in our controlled experiments in humans, we have a control group, somebody who doesn't have a disease. And in the control group, we'll actually go down, put a tube down, maybe some of you have had this done, a bronchoscopy, and isolate cells from the lung. If I do that in a control group in Texas, or in my previous location, we did a lot of work in Ohio, I'll get about 2 to 5 million cells. In a healthy control human who's willing to undergo bronchoscopy, $300, 20-minute procedure, usually medical students, actually, or maybe graduate students. Okay, there you go. And so did I.
I did one.
If I take the same control group of healthy people in Malawi or in South Africa, there are, in a control group, 10 times more cells in the quote-unquote healthy control. Do you know why? Anybody have a clue? In a healthy control in South Africa or Malawi? Environmental smoke. Environmental smoke. So in even conducting studies on a global disease across different areas of the world, there's baseline huge differences that one can see. There are also, in our studies that are at a more basic level, it is not difficult to see gender differences in just about anything we study immunologically, so we know that there are big differences in gender. And by the way, the HPV vaccine needs to be given to young boys and girls, because I disclose publicly, and some of you know this, I've recovered from HPV head and neck cancer myself. So it happens that we need to vaccinate to prevent cancers later in life in both men and women, so that's really important. I think there needs to be a big drive towards understanding changes in these immune pathways that we're studying, to really understand whether there is kind of an intermediate way to consider treatment options. And this is going on in clinical trials. And I think that really the answer is that one of anything doesn't do it for a population. In the tuberculosis area, we've had a vaccine since the 1920s. It's called the BCG vaccine. And after a lot of research, we know that 50% of the population may be protected. Nothing we give will be more than 50% if we don't get a little bit more refined in the way that we deliver drugs or vaccines. So I think it's a drive for the future, but it's definitely something to consider. And I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you, Larry. And Dr. Rizzo, you talked about the relevant reports that the American Lung Association publishes. What's in each of those reports, and that's important with regard to disparities and social determinants?
So if we start with the state of the air, I mean, this is based on about 960 EPA monitors across the country in each county, in most counties. And when you look at that, You get failing grades and good grades. Failing grades, unfortunately, seem to hit the marginalized communities more. Well, why is that? It's not just city and suburb, it's where you live in the city. Are you by an interstate? Do you live near factories? All those things will increase the amount of ozone and particle pollution that you're exposed to. And we know that air pollution in and of itself is a carcinogen. We also know it leads to higher incidence of asthma attacks, COPD. So people of color, people who experience poverty are unfortunately impacted by poor air quality more often because, again, social determinants of health. Where can they afford to live? They can't live out in the suburbs in a $100,000 home. They have to live near a highway. Can they afford to go to the doctor when they have a persistent cough? Not as quickly as other individuals. So the state of the air plays a big role. If we look at tobacco control, again, if we can't take the tobacco industry out of this. It's a matter of the tobacco industry targeting certain populations. Certainly, menthol has been shown to be much more attractive to the black smoker. Black men, and I'll show you in the lung cancer report, when they get diagnosed with lung cancer, they have worse outcomes. So trying to redirect where the tobacco industry, or stop them altogether if we can, targeting the black community, LGBTQ community, even trying to figure out where stores that sell tobacco are located with regard to where schools are. I mean, there's pressure in communities to put, the convenience stores right where everybody can go in and get their tobacco. So state of tobacco control says a lot more needs to be done at a legislative level, both at the state and the federal. Federal mainly having to do with the laws governing what the tobacco industry can and can't do. And vaping, unfortunately, has become an epidemic among middle schoolers and high schoolers, and basically is another generation of individuals who will be addicted to tobacco and go on to have, again, a higher risk of lung cancer and tobacco-related diseases, COPD, and heart disease. The last report is the state of lung cancer. And what this looks at is each state monitors how they diagnose cancer, how they record it, what stage it's in, what are the treatments given. Not every state has a very complete list of all those things. But if you look at state by state, you can go on and put in your zip code and find out. Some states show a very high incidence of not treating certain populations. And who again are we talking about? The marginalized communities. It's less likely for a black individual to get early diagnosis compared to a white individual. Some states keep track of no treatment at all. And again, if you look at the statistics, more individuals in the marginalized communities fall into the category of no treatment given. Now, there may be multiple reasons. Maybe they weren't candidates for it. Maybe they didn't go to the doctor to get it. But unfortunately, lung cancer and tobacco carry with them stigma. And we have to fight that as well, while we're also fighting the inequities that occur as a result of tobacco control, air quality, and lung cancer reports.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. And moving on to Dr. Taylor. Barbara, you're an expert in vaccine development. What does all of this mean for vaccine development for infections like SARS-CoV-2 and HIV?
Thank you. So I think there are two important things to think about when we're talking about vaccine development. One is the process itself. And I think we have had amazing advances in the last 3 years in terms of allowing, is this on? Okay, now it's on. Thank you. In how we do vaccine development. If you think about the advent of mRNA vaccine technology, it allows us to move more quickly through the pathway. The US government took a massive gamble on vaccine development by basically paying upfront for vaccines that had not been proven to work yet, which allowed us to expedite the vaccine development pathway without taking corners cut or anything in terms of the rigor of the science and the safety. So all of that is really exciting and very inspiring. The flip side of that is if you look at where vaccines are available in 2023, we've already talked about HPV vaccine availability, but just COVID vaccine availability, we have failed at distributing vaccines to communities that need them most. And one is just a matter of economics, but the other is a matter of systems. And I think we have to acknowledge that we work in environments where systemic racism and stigma and other structural factors prevent people from even wanting to receive a vaccine. And it has become very, very clear that vaccine misinformation is incredibly well organized and incredibly well funded. So I think we've learned a lot of lessons in science, and I'm really optimistic that we will be able to respond more rapidly in the future. I think the harder thing is undoing the structures that prevent us from being able to get vaccines to people, and to partner with communities and make friends ahead of time so that we can build trust, so that we can partner with communities as we're doing the research and enable us to actually deploy the science that we develop.
Thank you. And Dr. Dayhood, you've written and spoken a lot about personalized therapeutic prevention strategies. Can you explain for the audience what is an example maybe of a personalized therapeutic prevention strategy?
So yes, but I have to answer some questions. There's some great points brought up here first. So first of all, you're exactly right. Actually, young men and young women both need to be vaccinated. And the vaccination rates really vary greatly across the country. If you're in Rhode Island, it's about 88%. In West Virginia, it's about 32%. Rhode Island, the vaccination rate is so high that actually cancer prevention is actually hitting herd immunity, because we're never saying someone shouldn't get vaccinated, but the cancer rates are actually falling in the general population. Texas falls somewhere in the middle. I know you guys are never in the middle for anything, but we'll just let that out. So I want to point that out. So if we think about a personalized prevention strategy, I'll touch briefly again also on the therapeutic vaccine, but there's probably lifestyle interventions that actually make a difference. And, I'm a medical oncologist by training. We give drugs, right? That's who we are. But over time, there's increasing data by actually changing behaviors. You can impact your risk of cancer and the aggressiveness of the cancer. And this, again, is, largely diet, exercise, tobacco cessation. Right now, in this country, 45% of cancers are preventable by actually having healthier lifestyles, getting your vaccinations, and not smoking. So it's and alcohol. So these are all really important things. So there's that in the prostate cancer world. For men at the highest risk for prostate cancer, if they undergo sort of self-reported healthier lifestyle, they still may get prostate cancer, but it's not an aggressive prostate cancer. So once you know your individual risk, particularly if you have maybe a virally mediated potential cancer that would increase inflammation, to change your behavior to decrease the risk if you're doing actions that are increasing the inflammation. Now, when we talk about personalized, again, I agree with Larry. It probably won't be an individualized vaccine, but it'll reflect either your population, your serotype, or otherwise. So it would, in my world, and what we hope to launch, if we can figure out the funding and the interactions, starting about HPV, is find the population at the highest risk of developing a cancer. And again, head and neck cancers are harder to screen for, maybe saliva-based, but it's not, you don't have histopathology lesions. And then look at science, maybe of certain subtypes, maybe mixed with genetics, maybe mixed with racial ethnic minority groups. And in those groups at higher risk, based on expertise like folks on the panel, work through the pathway to go ahead and come up with a vaccine for that population. So that's broadly how it is, and happy to answer questions going on. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think watching the clock, we've got maybe time for one audience question. I can't see the audience, so you tell me if there's any interest or if there's some virtual questions coming through.
So there seems to be a great deal of RSV now, and in certain populations it seems to be highly risky. And I just wonder if anybody on the panel would have any comments about that.
The good news is there are RSV vaccines coming out and treatment coming out probably within the next year or so, may be approved by the FDA, especially for those young children, those 6-month-olds who have the high risk. But adults get it too.
The mRNA vaccine.
I'd have to check on that. I'm not sure.
It is one of the platforms.
I think one was approved this week.
Yeah.
For maternal RSV. Yes, all right, I'm not making this up. A maternal RSV vaccine was approved this week. So I think there's a lot in our future as far as new vaccines to be able to address some of these issues, which is really exciting.
More questions? we have time for one more?
Well, for quick answers.
Hi, thank you for such an amazing panel. So my name is Desiree. I'm a graduate student at Texas Biomed. And I had a question. As leaders in leading organizations, you guys pointed out that there's a lot of information out there about environmental factors that are increasing inflammation and risk. Do you guys know if there's any conversation also being had about decreasing the ages for, like, for example, colonoscopies in men, the age is 45, but you reported that there's a decrease in younger people's, as well as mammograms in women. And if these conversations aren't being had, how can we as researchers push for these conversations to happen? Thank you.
So we are having those conversations. The risks, we do need more data on what can be done to decrease the cancer beyond simply the increased incidence. So we have some large cohort studies right now, and we're studying those over time, and we're hopefully getting information. But again, looking at what intervention will have an impact. So a great question. So thank you.
So my question is, there's one other factor that I didn't hear any of you mention. It relates, I think, to the this unholy trinity that Dr. Schlesinger talked about, and to the relationship among these diseases and to the health equity question, and that is the role of stress. And I was wondering if you might just comment on that. Do you think that's a factor as well?
So yeah, I think there are very clear data that stress leads to inflammation. There are really emergent and somewhat terrifying data on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and their role in chronic stress and the long-term health consequences of that. But I think if you look at marginalized communities, you do see the other unholy trinity of the intersection of poverty, food insecurity, infectious diseases, and chronic inflammation that lead to worse health outcomes overall. So I think we have to think about the structural things that lead to all of those things, like crowding or like housing insecurity.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I'm Tiffany Smith, and I wanted to ask a question about trusted agents, and say that again because I think that's probably one of the most important pieces of this that you're missing. And I would say that relationships have to be built with trusted agents before we have another pandemic, and as we're trying to deal with things like this, and then also that researchers have to show up as humans. You have to show up in those spaces as human beings, because you are, and you're great clinicians. And if you show up and show out as as the good people that you are, you will experience the breakthroughs that you're looking for.
Give that a try. We didn't mention it because we did have a time limitation, but we could talk a lot about trusted messengers. Lung Association's been a grassroots organization since its inception, and we try to find messengers in the community, whether it's community health workers. We partner with the congressional and CNBC, National Black Churches. We know to get information out, it's not just hand out the pamphlet, not our website. They need to be coming from somebody culturally accepted by that community as trust. And with the way science has been dealt with over the last few years, we've got to build that trust to get the messages out.
I can add on to that. I think what I said about making friends before you need them is exactly that. I think we have to have a fundamental switch in the paradigm of how we do research. And I am lucky enough to do research in community, which means that when we are formulating a project, we are talking to members of the community, because I can sit and talk about HIV risk all day long, but the reality is I am not an 18 to 29-year-old person of risk in San Antonio, Texas. I mean, I'm sure y'all are surprised that I don't fit into that demographic, but that's not me. And so why should you listen to me? I need to find the people, and they need to tell me how to do the work and walk the walk. So I think that's fundamentally important. And we've seen good examples of that in COVID, actually.
I know people want to get lunch, but also building on our session next door, we need to build a community of researchers who look like the people in the community. Thanks.
Okay, so then I know we're over time. Bad news is we had to stop this session, which clearly had a lot of engagement. The good news is I'm 300 miles away, so no one can do anything to me about it. But I know I came away with a lot of ideas for where philanthropy might be able to support and move things forward. So this has been great for me. I'm sure it's instigated ideas for all the audience, regardless of what sector or industry you're coming from. The back of our, I don't know if you can see this, the back of our business cards say science is the answer here at Lytle Philanthropy. Is probably not going to focus well enough, but I can say the panel really gave me more confidence, in our scientists, the importance of science communication, and that although there are all these challenges we talked about today, the people on the panel, among others, are going to help us solve them. So thank you, Texas Biomed, for putting this together. Bringing together such a varied set of stakeholders is not easy, and to have important conversations like this, and you all really knocked it out of the park.